Okay, cheers and salutations. Welcome everyone to Americans Learn. My name is Kit. Please be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. And here we are to part three, or not part, the third part of the series, the Turkish Century, New Beginnings by Kraut. So here's the deal, folks, all you lovely, beautiful people. What we are going to do here, here's what we're going to do here. We are probably going to split this video into two parts. Part one and part two, because it's only an hour long. It's not like the others where it was like an hour, 40 minutes, hour and a half, give or take. But let's go ahead and check it out. And if listen, you hip cool cats, you do the right thing and support the original content creator. It's the right thing to do. It's the one thing to do. And I expect all you beautiful, lovely people to do that. So without further ado, since I'm in charge of the ones and twos, let's get ready to play this video in a 3, a 2, and an uno. Please don't show Constantinople getting burnt again.
This video is part 3 of a 3-part series. You will find the links to the first 2 parts in the description.
I now call on the distinguished Minister of Foreign Affairs of France, His Excellency Mr. Dominique Galouzou de Villepin.
L'option de la guerre peut apparaître a priori la plus rapide. Mais n'oublions pas qu'après avoir gagné la guerre, il faut construire la paix. Et ne nous voilons pas la face. Cela sera long et difficile, car il faudra préserver l'unité de l'Irak, rétablir de manière durable la stabilité dans un pays et une région durement affectés par l'intrusion de la force.
Und wir verdanken den USA unsere Demokratie. Die USA sind unverzichtbar für Frieden und Stabilität, aber für Deutschland haben sie eine ganz besondere Bedeutung, weil wir uns von den Nazis nicht selbst befreit haben und weil wir unsere Demokratie ohne ihre Hilfe nicht aufgebaut hätten. Nur meine Generation hat dabei gelernt, you have to make the case. And to make a case in the democracy, you must convince by yourself. Excuse me, I'm not convinced. This is my problem. And I cannot go to the public and say, oh, well, let's go to war because there are reasons and so on. And
Oh, boy. Yep. The weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We never found them. And look, I did 2 tours in Iraq. 2005 was my first deployment. And I was stationed in the Green Zone. Hell. Yeah. I was living in one of Saddam Hussein's palaces back in the day. Something I should put on my Tinder profile, maybe. Nah, nobody uses Tinder anymore. But make the case. But hey, did we ever find those WMDs? No, I don't think we ever did.
I don't believe in that.
Fidèle à l'esprit de la Charte des Nations Unies, qui est notre loi commune, la France considère que le recours à la force est le dernier recours, quand toutes les autres options ont été épuisées. La position de la France est partagée par la grande majorité de la communauté internationale. Les derniers débats ont clairement montré que le Conseil de sécurité n'était pas disposé, dans les circonstances présentes, à cautionner une marche précipitée à la guerre.
Liebe Mitbürgerinnen und Mitbürger, die Welt steht am Vorabend eines Krieges. Meine Frage war und ist: Rechtfertigt das Ausmaß der Bedrohung, die von dem irakischen Diktator ausgeht, den Einsatz des Krieges, der Tausenden von unschuldigen Kindern, Frauen und Männern den sicheren Tod bringen wird? Meine Antwort in diesem Fall war und ist nein.
During the first years of the 20th
Oh, hey, look, there's Tom. Our first friend from MySpace. Wasn't he great? Sorry we left you for Facebook, man. We failed you.
century, when these 3 said no to the war in Iraq, it had a substantial impact on the politics of Europe. Many Europeans at first shunned them for making a supposedly wrong decision and betraying their allies. But as it increasingly turned out to be the correct decision, it called into doubt a fundamental structure of European politics. Since the end of the Second World War, Europe built, expanded, and saw itself as an economic zone focused on itself, with a goal of building and ensuring peace amongst themselves to avoid past catastrophes repeating themselves and to ensure prosperity amongst themselves. Foreign policies and interventions were left to the Americans, with the exception of France, who didn't like being told what to do, especially in Africa. The only time this arrangement had been seriously challenged was during the Vietnam War, which was the first and until 2003 only time that European democracies had publicly taken a stance against an American war. Iraq changed this. If America could get it so wrong and drag us into such a disaster, isn't a common foreign policy commitment to her more of a liability than anything else? France and Germany spearheaded something new as a result, the idea of a Europe as a democratic counterweight to the United States on the world stage, or at the very least that Europe no longer had to follow America's direction on the world stage. Someone completely opposed this, others were open to the war in Iraq until it turned worse and worse. But what we often tend to forget today is that one of the main partners amongst the nations that opposed this war in Iraq and thought of Europe in different and new terms was Turkey. But the waters are also a little more muddied than simply that. One of the main reasons for Turkey's opposition to the war in Iraq was that the previous war in Iraq had greatly damaged the Turkish economy for an internationally enforced embargo that cost the Turks between $80 billion and $100 billion. Additionally, remember all the military coups and purges throughout the last decades? After the end of the Cold War, it was increasingly revealed that almost all of these coups and purges had happened with the approval and even support of the United States. These revelations deeply soured the image of the United States within Turkey. Previously seen as an ally against communism and a partner in trade and modernization, the United States were now increasingly viewed as a sinister force, intervening behind the scenes against the will and the interests of the Turkish people. At the time, both France and Germany had leaderships who welcomed the idea of a Turkish EU membership, seeing her as a positive influence in creating a new European and democratic power bloc. And as the 2000s progressed, Turkey was courted more and more, even by the United States. It is these days overshadowed by current events, but the Erdogan we know today didn't have much in common with the Erdogan of the early 2000s.
Really?
In the late 1990s, he had a substantial falling out with his mentor Necmettin Erbakan. Instead of rejoining him, he founded his own party and proclaimed to leave the old radical ways behind in favor for a more democratic Islamic conservative party. He found new allies within the Gülen movement. The people he wanted to court and build a new right wing around were the moderate Islamic conservatives, those successful conservative businessmen that developed throughout the 1980s. There would be no more demands for Sharia, no more challenges to the separation of religion and state. There was to be democratic consensus building and an acknowledgement of differing viewpoints and the opposition. New people came to surround Erdogan's movement, people like Ahmet Davutoglu and Abdullah Gül. Abdullah Gül in particular gives us great insights into what this redirection meant. Gül was raised by a conservative family, studied economics in London, and then worked for 8 years at a bank in Saudi Arabia. He would consequently be the first leading Turkish politician who spoke Arabic, but also spoke fluent English and understood European social and political dynamics.
So our boy here liked to get around and party it up. Okay.
Their main goal would be to conduct social and economic reforms to elevate the country's status and
I just saw that. Hold on.
their main goal
Hold
would
on.
be to conduct social and
Papers, please. Let's just say, me being a security guard, I was an unreasonable prick when I played this game.
economic reforms to elevate the country's status and to tie it economically and socially into Europe, but to also forge new ties and deeper ties into the Middle East. When we look at a map of Europe that Europeans are so familiar with, Turkey always seems to be down there in the corner, peeking out from down there at us. When we look at the map of the Middle East that so many of us are familiar with, Turkey always
and it's a good thing we don't ever get involved in that region at all, period. And everything works itself out swimmingly well.
always seems to be up there at the edge, peeking down at the rest. But move the map so that Turkey stands in the center, and you will notice how the common perspective of Turkey at the periphery is very much mistaken. It is a place that stands at the center between two cultural spheres. However, geography alone does not dictate a nation's success. The geographic determinist likes to look through maps, analyze the geographic features within and around state and stateless constructs.
Hey, buddy. It's Rome.
to then try to determine and explain the limitations of these entities or even predict their futures. And Turkey is at the same time one of the favorites, but also one of the biggest counterpoints to the idea of our geographic surroundings shaping who we are and what we do. The geography of Anatolia has...
Look, it's beautiful. It's glorious. It's Byzantium. Look at how beautiful it is.
Without a doubt shaped much of the expansions and limitations of the various entities that came to have control over it. But you will have noticed that we spent almost an entire hour talking about social developments within Turkish society in which close to no foreign entanglements appeared. Despite what many claim is a geography that invites such entanglements to happen. That is because Turkish society, irrespective of its own and surrounding geography, decided to do so. Ataturk demanded an end to foreign entanglements, conquests and influence. The Turks should embrace their new republic at home, stay within the confines of this new republic and not involve themselves in whatever nonsense foreigners were up to. And for almost an entire century that is exactly what the Turks did. With Erdogan taking the lead, that changed. Turkey reconnected with the idea that it stood at the center and not at the periphery, and as such had a role to play in this world, both in the West and in the East. Part of this meant more determined negotiations over European Union membership, which resulted in the AKP joining the conservative bloc of European political parties, known as the Christian Democrats. This, by the way, is not a EU organization, but the general European political institution in which European conservative parties come together to flesh out ideas and cooperation. It also has a left-wing counterpart. Revealing in that regard was when the Austrian news magazine Profil interviewed the vice president of the Justice and Development Party, Murat Mercan, on why his Islamic Conservative Party had joined the club of European Christian conservative parties.
We are all Democrats, and there can be no democracy without secularism. If the Christian Democrats were not secular, they would also not fit in together with us, because the AKP is a secular party. What we share with European conservatives are the values of tradition and...
Oh, look at that. Everyone get along. Merry Christmas. I don't know how to pronounce that word on the Turkish side, but I'm pretty sure it brings goodwill and cheer. Why not?
Family. Those are what all religions have in common and separates us from social democrats, liberals, and Greens.
Erdogan sought out a common alliance of the religious conservatives, a sort of alliance of the Abrahamic religious conservatives found throughout the world's democracies. And for this purpose he attempted, at least on the surface, to liberalize society. He tolerated what, ironically, his secular and liberal predecessors had not. And one of the reasons for why he could do so was that his movement and the party was free from the ideological restraints of Ataturk's nationalism. That nationalism had demanded one people, one language, one culture under a secular republic. Erdogan embraced the idea of multiple peoples, multiple cultures, and many faiths and many beliefs within a society. In April 2007, when Islamist terrorists murdered 2 Turkish and 1 German Christian, he famously confronted what had happened.
We have 36 different cultures, religions, and more identities amongst us who we all have to respect. There are 6,000 mosques in Europe that are all protected, and we must be able to provide an equal amount, if not even more, safety and security for every single Christian church and Jewish synagogue in our country.
Ataturk's nationalism saw the different identities in culture, language, and religion as a private matter, relegated to private homes, and forbade the formation of identity-driven politics as something that could challenge the vision of a unified national identity. In that regard, Ataturk's nationalism had more in common with the Middle East that he wished to leave behind than he may have first thought. Throughout many Middle Eastern societies, differences are often stumped into silence by national myths and fictions, demanding a unification under a pretense that eradicates all differences. And Erdogan stood up to that with an alternative, a vision of openness that embraced these differences. It should not be a contradiction to hold the Turkish passport while being a Jewish Armenian, a Christian Arab, or a Muslim Caucasian. The contradictions of the unified nationalist vision is something that Erdogan was himself very much aware of, as his family are the descendants of Muslim Caucasians from the Caucasus who fled to Turkey from the Russian Empire. It is ironic that Erdogan became the first prime minister to permit pride parades to take place in Turkey, the first to allow the Kurdish language to be taught in schools and to be broadcast on radio and TV, the most successful at coming to a peaceful arrangement with the Kurds, the prime minister under whom the Kurds started to participate within the democratic process, though it was under him that Turkish women engaged in the workforce like under no other previous government, and that social norms dictated by tradition started to get eroded by younger generations. Politically, previous governments had seen themselves as agents of progress within the republic, and it is somewhat ironic that what one could call social progress didn't arrive through pushing forward in alignment with a doctrine of progress, but by taking a huge step backward and letting things within society evolve by themselves. More women started wearing the veil under Erdogan in what could be seen as a step backward, but those women were also better educated, increasingly part of the workforce and more politically active and better paid in what could be seen as a large step forward. What developed is what we could see or be described as an Islamic modernity, that the conflict between religion and modernity, which so many Islamists had tried to end with a defeat of modernity, was in the end resolved through Said Nursi's vision of a compromise leading into an Islamic modernity. That the customs, norms, religion and traditions of the land were no longer an obstacle in the way of achieving a modern society, but part and parcel of the process of creating this modernity. Economically, Erdogan would rely on a class of educated small and big business owners created during the 1980s. With tax cuts and subsidies, he helped Turkish business grow, and with a foreign policy of opening to foreign markets, he helped expand their reach into foreign markets. An export-orientated economy was built selling textiles, fridges, cars and other machine parts are no longer just vegetables, and not just for domestic markets but throughout a range of many foreign countries. His favorite domestic economic policy would be one that he had embraced during his
Don't forget all those stonks.
time as mayor of Istanbul: infrastructure development.
Constantinople. That's the name of it. That is... Never mind.
A new bridge across the Bosporus, expanded metro systems, and even subsidies for shopping centers that were seen as an economic infrastructure. The contracts for these were dished out en masse to various construction companies, expanding the already large construction sector. At the same time, Turkey, as a tourism destination, was aggressively promoted throughout Europe, resulting in extensive growth in that sector. Erdogan came closer than any of his predecessors to resolving Turkey's longest conflict as well. He had the Admar Cathedral, the traditional seat of the Armenian Church, renovated and invited Armenian dignitaries to the opening of that cathedral. In 2005, the Turks and Armenians almost normalized relations, but the army, which still had some political power, intervened and stopped that process. His big opening towards the east in foreign policy came in 2004, when Assad was invited to visit Turkey. Syria at the time was an internationally isolated nation. What Erdogan had hoped to achieve with this visit was a normalization of relations to Turkey, but to also help Syria establish itself again within the international community. If successful, Turkey could have presented itself as a partner for nations willing to break out of international isolation. And even though he failed with Assad, it did not stop him from tying Turkey deeper economically and culturally within the Islamic world and the Middle East, like no other Turkish prime minister before him had. In particular, Turkey found interests in the periphery, the often ignored majority Muslim countries to be found on the edges of Africa, which were all very welcoming to new economic ties, investment and closer cooperation. And this increased in 2006 when both the Germans and French had a change in leadership who both negated the idea of Turkey joining the European Union. Turkey increasingly looked east after this, to new partners and friends within North Africa, Central Asia and the Middle East. However, underlying conflicts and future conflict potential was increasingly brought to the surface. The increasing activity of Turkey within the Middle East resulted in ever greater suspicion over that activity by the Saudis, Iranians, Americans, but especially the Russians. However, not just abroad, but also domestic conflict increasingly boiled up to the surface. In April 2007, the Turkish army posted a statement on the internet declaring that recent political developments, including the election of a religious president, might lead to them to intervene within the politics of the country. And in 2005, Erdogan approved of a bill that strengthened Article 301. This law stems from the time when Ataturk grabbed whatever he could from the law books of European countries. Whatever seemed advanced and in service of modernity was grabbed, including this law, which was basically just copied word for word from the law books of fascist Italy. It
Of course. What could possibly go wrong from click, copy, and paste from Benito Mussolini's work, huh? What could go wrong?
Criminalized insulting of Turkishness, which could mean basically anything, and that is the point. It's a so-called rubber law, a law designed to be stretched and twisted to be used for whatever the rulers deemed necessary to imprison whoever annoys them. Erdogan's changes were so extreme that this law basically was expanded to make it illegal to critique the foreign policy of the government. The opening of society itself also released political forces that had, for a very long time, been dormant. Hrant Dink was a curious and courageous figure, an Armenian Turk, a political liberal and journalist who ran a small paper in Turkey. He advocated for the normalization of relations between Turkey and Armenia. He demanded an acknowledgement of the Armenian genocide. He harshly criticized nationalism of any sort. He had revealed that Sabiha Gökçen was in fact an Armenian. He published the stories of the remaining Armenian community in Turkey, in both Turkish and Armenian, and he insisted that it was no contradiction to be an Armenian while also being a patriotic Turk, that this republic was a place of many cultures and that Armenian was one of them. He was shot dead by a Turkish far-right Islamist on the streets in front of his office in 2007. Yet his death would reveal substantial changes.
What could go wrong? What could possibly go wrong?
Changes that had taken place in society and would shape future social conflict to come. His funeral was attended by tens of thousands, Turks, Kurds, Armenians, mostly young, who marched through the streets in protest, shouting the slogans, "We are all Kurds, we are all Armenians, we are all Turks, we are all Hrant Dink," in Turkish, in Kurdish, and in Armenian. With the shackles of Ataturk's rigid nationalist vision removed, people asserted their identities and made room for the identities of others. A generation that came to grow up after the last coup would take advantage of the new openness, and a political left that had been dormant for 3 decades would come to challenge the new establishment that Erdogan had become. Should you ever find yourself browsing through popular Turkish music, you will notice that hip-hop is pretty popular in Turkey, but there's also a substantial cultural difference. Whilst in the United States rappers brag about their wealth, flash their jewelry, and show off their expensive cars, the Turkish rapper walks barefoot through the ruins of a broken society, lamenting the inequality and disparity of society. Or if you want to go even more radical, digs mass graves for rich people, as cleaning ladies shoot up the CEOs of a company, a chauffeur strangles a billionaire, abused prostitutes cut the throat of a wealthy John, and waiters poison their rich customers.
That's... Hey, man. Listen. Treat people with dignity and respect, okay? Otherwise, they'll come after you.
This might come across as a mere pop culture side note, but in fact is reflective of a wider social problem, one that has been around since the 50s and which Erdogan couldn't fix but only made worse: the wealth inequality. When Erdogan came to power, the wealthiest 10% of the country owned 67% of the country's wealth, which increased over the next 2 decades to 81%. Meanwhile, the remaining 90% had their share decrease from 32% to 18%. Turkey under Erdogan became an increasingly unequal society. The economy boomed and capital moved into the country, but that capital ended up in fewer hands. And when you look at who these hands belonged to, you will find that it was mainly the hands of construction company owners owners and bankers, members of the new educated Islamic conservative elite that emerged during the 1980s, of which many have very close political ties to Erdogan. One of Erdogan's favorite economic policies had been gargantuan building projects, be they a new bridge across the Bosporus, a system of highways, new metro systems, or the building of a new Bosporus canal. One particular favorite of his was the promotion of the building of shopping centers and malls all across the country. And most of these projects were built by people close to him, who through these contracts became increasingly wealthy. The smell of corruption started to rise all around him in ways that he couldn't simply wipe away. There's also another note on the shopping malls that started to appear. In her book, Turkey, the Insane and the Melancholy, Eceteme Kuran describes a weird social phenomenon of Turkey during the mid and late 2000s. Poor people, in particular families, would go on family walks, strolling through the shopping malls with their kids to look and gaze upon the variety of goods and products on sale, in a way rejoicing over the better days that they presumed would soon be theirs. The symbols of wealth that became erected within the country did more often than not reflect the actual wealth of the population. There were more jobs, there was more capital, but even though Turkey had become a wealthier society, the Turks didn't become a much wealthier people in general. The average living standard rose, but only a select few had their living standards increase dramatically. At a political rally, Erdogan once bragged about how many fridges were being sold in Turkey since he became prime minister, a statement that was widely mocked in Turkey. "We didn't store milk in hollowed-out trees before you came along," an opposition member remarked. And gradually, over the course of several years, people started noticing the increasing inequality throughout the country, as well as several other things. The Islamic welfare kitchens and food handouts that the Justice and Development Party did, they certainly looked good and made the AKP look like a party that cared dutifully for the poor. But why did they only appear when it was election season and then disappear again? In 2000,
It's all a clever plan. Get people to be tricked, and then you have them as your loyal puppets.
2007, several army officers were arrested and tried in the Ergenekon trials that took place until 2012. Several military officers were charged with conspiring to overthrow the state and undermine democracy, something that may have been initially welcomed as the final remnants of authoritarian soldiers being removed from power. But why did so many journalists also get arrested? And how come the journalists critical of Erdogan kept ending up being charged in conspiracy trials? 2007 can be seen as a watershed moment. France and Germany blocked Turkey's EU entry, and as a result, Erdogan proclaimed that his country would be looking east, but also became increasingly authoritarian. The ghosts of Menderes, but also of other authoritarian-style rulers that preceded him, came back to rear their ugly heads. The institutions of the state meant to be impartial were again increasingly used to clamp down on opposition members, shut down the press, spread propaganda, and cover up wrongdoings by the government. Erdogan started falling out with several old political companions and increasingly introduced more conservative and Islamist measures. A 300% alcohol tax, as he denounced the supposed
Whoa! Okay, that's going too far.
degeneracy of young Turks that went out and partied during the weekends. His rallies became gender segregated, and Islamic virtues increasingly praised as he publicly murmured about the reintroduction of the death penalty. However, Turkey itself had also changed. When Erdogan's Minister for Family Affairs made a public statement about the lacking traditional manliness of modern urban Turkish men, her Twitter feed was bombarded by pictures sent by Turkish gay couples. Urban Turkish society had changed substantially. The poor farm laborers who moved into the cities during the 50s to the 1970s may have been very religious and very conservative. Their children may have also been religious and conservatives, but their children, who grew up in this modern urban environment that was well connected into the world, they became increasingly more moderate, liberal, and even left-leaning. A generation in rebellion against an establishment, and the establishment that they grew up under was Erdogan, yesteryear's anti-establishment. Young Turks today are on average less religious, more secular, more open-minded, and more progressive than even some of their European counterparts. Women who don't wear the veil, people who drink, people who have sex before marriage, people who are even open atheists, people willing to question the status quo more publicly than even previous generations had. The demographic change to the political binary of the country started to increasingly even itself out. In 2013, these two social forces crashed into conflict. First, several people close to Erdogan, including government ministers and high-ranking members of Istanbul local governments, were arrested in a large corruption probe. Erdogan viciously lashed out. He fired the police chief of Istanbul. Almost all the police officers
Constantinople
involved in the corruption probe were also fired, and he had the prosecutor arrested while blaming a conspiracy of his former political ally, Abdullah Gülen. The prosecutor was later released, but the damage had been done and his public image was greatly diminished. A government-critical newspaper was shut down, and then when a small group of protesters demanded that the Gezi Park of Istanbul should not be changed into yet another shopping mall, he cracked down on that small peaceful group with extreme police brutality, which resulted in nationwide protests and riots that lasted for months. The secular, liberal and left-leaning movements of the country, who had been in the socio-political background for decades, suddenly re-emerged into the forefront. From there on, the mask would increasingly slip. Erdogan drifted more and more to the political right. He re-engaged in a policy of hostility towards Armenia. He flared up the conflict with the Kurds again. He would crack down on any and all opposition. He would use political brutality against opposition protests and those who he saw as threatening to Islamic values, be they labor union protests or LGBT rights parades. The result of this is a social conflict unlike in any other place, where traditional Islamic values clash with a modern vision for a society from the West. And in many ways this results in Turkey being a place of stark contradictions like can be seen almost nowhere else in the world. Hande Kader was a Turkish trans woman, trans activist, and sex workers' rights activist. She was one of the leading figures in the riots that resulted when Erdogan attempted to shut down pride parades with police force. In 2016, she was kidnapped, brutally tortured, gang-raped, doused in gasoline and burnt alive. She became a symbol of a very dark truth in Turkey. That is, that Turkey has the highest murder rate of trans people in the world, and one of the highest murder rates of gays and lesbians in the world. Yet, the large social contradiction is that Turkey is also the only majority Muslim society where people can be openly gay. Turkey is the only Muslim country with an elected lesbian politician. It has the largest and most vibrant gay scene of any Muslim country. A place where gay and lesbian Arabs go to feel free. A place more tolerant and open-minded than even many European countries. Yet it is also a place where for Turkish gays and lesbians, taking advantage of that freedom can be very dangerous. This is a place where women have more freedoms than in any other majority Muslim country. A place where theoretically they should be able to earn and achieve anything. But this is also a country where the First Lady says that all that a woman needs to know they can learn from being in a man's harem. And where most women who achieve any success are those who find that within the limited space that an Islamic conservative-dominated field may permit them to have. It's one of the few Muslim-majority countries with strict laws forbidding domestic violence, yet the domestic violence rates are very high. This is a country where people see themselves as agents of progress aligned with values seen in Europe and North America and allied with an international movement for progress. But those very supposed allies abroad have also abandoned them as they find themselves in conflict with religious virtues that in Europe and North America are defended as minority values. This is a society with a conservative set of beliefs, traditions and social norms wishing to tie deeper into the Middle East, yet at the same time those very same right-leaning political blocs often look down upon the peoples of the Middle East with an almost racist contempt. You can see this social conflict as a confrontation of religion with secularism, tradition with modernity, Islam with modernity, or something else. Whatever you call it depends on your beliefs and political framing of the situation, but the fact remains that even though Turkey also undergoes social upheaval through other sources of division, this underlying social conflict, which has very much been around for almost 2 centuries, still deeply affects the country to this day.
We're going to stop here, and we'll continue on with the second part. Oh my goodness, I can't believe we're almost at the end next week. So, wow, there's a lot to unpack here. First of all, the whole history of Erdogan taking over the country, and, well, I guess masks off, dance off, pants off, he's taking control. I'm unfamiliar too much with modern Turkish history, especially politics and everything around that nature, but maybe clearer heads will prevail. Maybe there will be peace. I guess we'll get to the final conclusion, but I do want to give a huge shout out to Kraut for putting together not 1, not 2, but 3 very detailed videos, and I want to definitely thank our viewing audience for inviting us on this journey with Kraut and checking out the history of Turkey, its beginning and rise as a republic. Not a huge fan of that word Istanbul, but don't worry. Nonetheless, I guess we'll find out what the shocking conclusion will be, especially going into 2016. I wasn't expecting that curveball of the invasion of Iraq, though. 2003. What an innocent year for things to go crazy. Till then, this has been Americans Learned. Please take good care of yourselves and each other. Drink that water. Keep your heads on a swivel. Support the original content creator. The link is in the description box below, you hip cool cats. And treat each other with dignity and respect. That's the best we could do in this crazy upside down world.